Nobody in Caerwyn Hold remembered exactly when Yseult Marrow had arrived. That was the strange truth of it. She was simply there one autumn, thin-armed and quiet, folded into the kitchens like she'd always belonged among the flour sacks and the copper pots, and the servants who might have asked questions were too busy surviving the king's temper to bother. 5 years, 5 winters of carrying trays up the long stone stairs to the high table, 5 summers of scrubbing wax from the great hall floors after feasts that ran too late, 5 years of being furniture in a court that had long since stopped seeing her as a person at all. That was, of course, exactly what she wanted them to think. King Hrothmar Aldane, called the Alpha King by every tongue in the 6 territories, called worse things by the wolves who'd tried to challenge him and failed, sat at the head of that table most nights, with a face like a closed door. He was not an unkind man, not exactly. He was a tired one. Power had worn him down to something hard and watchful, a man who trusted almost no one, and the ones he did trust were, as Yseult had come to learn over 5 patient years, precisely the ones who deserved it least. She refilled his goblet that night, without looking at him. That was the first rule she'd taught herself. Never look at him longer than a servant should. Never let her eyes catch on the silver at his temples, or the scar along his jaw, or the particular exhausted way he pressed 2 fingers to his brow when he thought no one was watching. A servant who looked too long got noticed. A servant who got noticed got questioned. And Yseult Marrow could not afford to be questioned, because Yseult Marrow was not technically supposed to exist. She was the last daughter of House Varn, a house the crown had declared extinguished 5 years ago, in a night of fire and blood that the court called an accident, and Yseult knew, with the certainty of someone who'd watched her father's steward smile while the roof beams came down, had been nothing of the kind. She had come to Caerwyn Hold, not for revenge, though revenge would have been the simpler story. She had come because on the night her family burned, she had heard 3 voices in the smoke-thick dark outside her window, and one of them had used a phrase, a particular, old, ceremonial phrase belonging to the Hold's inner council, that no outsider could have known. Someone close to the king had ordered House Varn's end, and in 5 years of pouring wine and folding linens and existing at the exact height of a servant's downcast eyes, Yseult Marrow had learned exactly who. Lord Chancellor Edmund Straith, advisor to 2 kings, beloved, trusted, and, Yseult now knew with the flat certainty of long observation, a liar so accomplished that he'd built an entire second court beneath the real one, a shadow parliament of bribed stewards, blackmailed guards, and one deeply frightened young clerk who kept the real ledgers in a floor cavity beneath his bed. She knew the names of every man Straith had paid to look the other way. She knew which of the king's personal guard reported to him instead of to the crown. She knew, worst of all, that the fire that had killed her family had been set not out of political necessity, but because her father had discovered Straith was quietly diverting the Northern Territory's war levies into his own coffers, years of gold meant for soldiers and grain stores gone, and she knew that the king did not know any of it. 5 years she had watched them lie to his face, watched Straith stand at the king's right hand and call himself loyal in the same breath he schemed, watched the court incline their heads to a man they should have feared, all while King Hrothmar Aldane, sharp-eyed about wolves and war and border skirmishes, remained utterly, maddeningly blind to the rot 2 feet from his throne. She had almost spoken once, in her 2nd year. She'd gotten as far as the base of the dais before her nerve had failed, because what was the word of a serving girl against the Lord Chancellor of the realm? And what would happen to that serving girl the moment Straith learned she'd tried? So she had waited. She had gathered. And she had grown, without meaning to, terribly, inconveniently aware of the king himself, not as a target or a means to an end, but as a man. She noticed how he was gentler with the stable children than with his own council. She noticed he ate less than a king his size should most nights, as if some private grief sat in him like a stone he couldn't put down. She noticed once that he'd stopped an execution she was certain Strather had orchestrated, with a single flat word, on nothing more than instinct, and she had gone back to the kitchens that night, with her hands shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. That was the danger of 5 years. You could go in with a mission and come out, quietly, with a heart you hadn't asked for. She remembered sometimes, the night before the fire, the last ordinary night her family had ever had. Her father, Lord Casimir Varn, had sat up late by candlelight going over the northern accounts, with a frown she'd learned to recognize as trouble, though she'd been too young that year to understand what kind. Her mother had scolded him for burning oil so late. Her older brother had teased Yseult for falling asleep at the supper table. It had been, in every visible way, a house at peace. She had not known then that her father had already sent a sealed letter to the Crown 3 days earlier, a letter that never arrived, because it had been intercepted, read, and quietly destroyed by a hand she now knew to be Strath's own steward. She had not known that her father suspected the Chancellor by name, or that he had begun, in secret, compiling his own ledger of the northern levies' true numbers against the Crown's official record. She had learned all of this later, piece by piece, the way a person learns the shape of a wound, by pressing on it in the dark. What she had known, immediately and with a child's total certainty, was the smell of smoke at an hour when no hearth should have been lit that high, and the sound of her mother screaming her brother's name, and the particular, unbearable silence that came after. She had run. 7 years old, barefoot in the snow, she had run until an old woman from a neighbouring holding, a woman who owed House Varn a debt from years before, and paid it, that night, in full, had pulled her into a cellar and hidden her until the fire had burned down to embers, and the men who set it had ridden away satisfied that nothing of House Varn remained to accuse them. Nothing of House Varn except one girl who grew up in that old woman's care, believing correctly that survival and silence were the same skill, and that if she ever wanted justice, she would have to build it herself, brick by brick, inside the walls of the very hold that had ordered her family's end. She had chosen the name Marrow the day she walked through Caerwyn Hold's kitchen gate at 12 years old, hollow-cheeked and unremarkable, offering to scrub pots for bread. It was, she thought, a fittingly quiet name, the part of the bone no one looks at, and the part that keeps everything else alive. The first 2 years in the kitchens had taught her the geography of the hold the way other children learned letters. She learned which corridors the night guard walked and when. She learned that the laundress, old Fenner, gossiped without meaning to, and could be mined for names and dates if you asked your questions sideways enough. She learned the particular creak of the 3rd step on the servant's stair that meant someone was coming, and the exact hour the Chancellor's personal clerk left his study unlocked to relieve himself, which was not long but was, over enough repetitions, long enough. She built her case the way her father must have built his, quietly, in fragments, trusting no single piece of evidence to hang the whole truth on. A name overheard here. A ledger figure that didn't match the public accounting there. A guard's unexplained new boots, paid for by wages he shouldn't have had. Nothing damning on its own. Everything damning together. If only someone with the patience to gather it all existed. She had not expected that someone to be her. She had only known that no one else was going to do it, and that House Varn's name deserved better than a shrug and a word like accident. The winter that changed everything began, as these things do, with something small. A courier arrived from the northern border in the dead of a snowstorm, half frozen, demanding audience. Yseult was carrying firewood past the receiving hall when she heard the man's ragged voice through the door. Something about the garrison at Hallowmere going 3 months unpaid, about soldiers deserting, about a border that would not hold through spring if the crown didn't send funds immediately. She saw Straith's face before anyone else did, just a flicker, there and gone, smoothed over into concern so fast that a person watching normally would have missed it entirely. But Yseult had spent 5 years learning the specific grammar of that man's face, and what she saw was not surprise. It was calculation. He already knew. Of course he knew. The unpaid levies were his levies, sitting in a vault somewhere, with his name quietly attached to the ledger beneath a false one. "I'll see to it personally," Straith told the king smoothly, laying a hand on his sovereign's shoulder with the easy affection of a man who had earned every inch of that trust. "The treasury's been strained since the Eastern drought, Your Grace. Leave the accounting to me. You have enough weighing on you." King Hrothmar's jaw tightened, but he nodded, because that was the terrible efficiency of Straith's lie. It always came wrapped around a truth. The treasury was strained. The drought had happened. Every falsehood Straith told was built on a foundation of things that were real, which was exactly what made them so impossible to see through. Yseult stood in the corridor with an armful of firewood and watched the king's shoulders sag, with something that looked, for just a moment, like the particular loneliness of a man who has to trust someone and has chosen, wrongly, to trust the person standing closest. She went to her small room above the kitchens that night and took out the floorboard where she kept her true evidence. Copies of ledger pages made in painstaking secrecy over 3 years, a signet ring wax seal she'd lifted an impression of, a letter in Straith's own hand that she'd found half burned in a brazier and salvaged before it turned to ash. She laid them out on her narrow bed, the way she had 100 times before, and for the 100th time, she asked herself the same unanswerable question. If she spoke now, would the king believe a servant girl over the man who had raised him from his father's deathbed? Or would she simply join House Varn in whatever quiet grave Straither kept ready for inconvenient truths? The next morning brought her closer to an answer than she wanted. She was sent, as she sometimes was, to deliver mending to the Chancellor's private wing, a task the head housekeeper handed out reluctantly, since Straith was known to be particular about who set foot near his study. Yseult had used those errands, over the years, sparingly and with great care, never taking more than she could memorize in the handful of seconds a servant was permitted to linger. That morning, the study door stood very slightly ajar, and through the gap she heard 2 voices she recognized at once, Straith's, low and clipped, and the voice of Captain Ander Voss, commander of the Hold's eastern garrison, a man whose loyalty she had long suspected was for sale to the highest bidder still breathing. "The Northern levy shortfall will draw questions past this season," Voss was saying. "The border lords aren't fools, whatever the king believes of them." "Let them ask their questions of me," Straith answered, and there was something almost bored in it, the confidence of a man who had weathered worse suspicions than this one. "I have weathered 9 years of questions, Captain. I will weather 9 more if it comes to that. See that Halomir's quartermaster understands the delay is temporary, and see that he understands what happens to men who forget how to be patient." Yseult did not wait to hear more. She finished her errand with hands that did not shake, because 5 years had at least taught her that much, and walked back to the kitchens at exactly the pace a servant girl with nothing on her mind would walk. But that night, by candle stub in her small room above the kitchens, she added Captain Voss's name to the floorboard ledger beneath her bed, and understood, with a cold clarity that settled somewhere beneath her ribs, that Straith's rot ran further into the crown's own guard than she had let herself believe. It meant her case, when she finally brought it, could not simply topple the Chancellor. It would have to be strong enough to survive men with swords, who had every reason to make sure it never reached the king's ear at all. It was Yseult's own carelessness in the end that nearly ended her. 3 nights after the courier's arrival, she was sent to clear the small council chamber after a late session. The king, Straithy, and 2 of the border lords had argued past midnight about the Hallowmere garrison, and eventually the lords had left in a temper, and the king had dismissed Straith with a short word, wanting, apparently, to sit alone with the maps a while longer. Yseult didn't know he was still in the room when she slipped in the side door to collect a folder of correspondence Straith had left behind. Folder she recognized, because she'd catalogued its twin in her mind a year ago. Habit, more than plan, made her open it, and there, plain as daylight, was a letter in Straith's hand instructing a garrison quartermaster to delay the northern disbursement one further season, as discussed. She was so intent on it that she didn't hear the king rise from the shadowed window seat behind the map table. "That correspondence isn't yours to read." His voice was low, controlled, dangerous in the particular way of a man who has spent a lifetime learning not to shout. Yseult's whole body went cold. She turned, the letter still in her hand, and found King Hrothmar Aldane looking at her with an expression she had never once, in 5 years, been close enough to see directed at herself. Sharp, assessing, and entirely terrifyingly awake. For one heartbeat she considered lying, dropping the folder, apologizing, fleeing into the anonymous safety of servanthood. It was what 5 years of survival had trained into her bones, but something in her, grief, or courage, or simple exhaustion at the weight of 5 years of silence, broke instead. "No," she said, "it isn't. But you should read it anyway." The king went very still. It was not the stillness of a man about to call his guards, though for one long breath-held moment Yseult thought it might be. It was the stillness of something older and more careful, a man recalibrating, in real time, everything he thought he understood about the servant girl standing in front of him, and about the letter shaking, very slightly, in her hand. "Say that again," he said quietly. Yseult's pulse hammered so loudly she was certain he could hear it across the room. Every instinct 5 years of hiding had built into her screamed at her to soften the words, to claim confusion, to become invisible again before the sentence could be used against her. She ignored all of it. "I have watched your Chancellor lie to you for 5 years, Your Grace," she said, steadier this time. "I have watched him smile at your right hand while he empties the crown's coffers into his own. And I have watched this court incline its head to him, as though loyalty were a thing a man could simply perform well enough to earn, rather than something he either has or does not." "You're a servant," Hrothmar said, not cruelly, but as a man testing a plank before he put his weight on it. "You pour wine. You clear tables. How does a woman who pours wine come to know the private correspondence of my Lord Chancellor? Because for 5 years no one has looked at me long enough to wonder," Yseult said. "That is the entire architecture of how a lie like his survives, Your Grace. Not cleverness, invisibility. He is trusted because he is watched by no one, the same way I have learned everything I know because I am watched by no one either. We have that much in common, your Chancellor and I. The difference is what we built with it." Something moved behind the king's eyes. Not belief yet, not fully, but the first crack of a man willing to consider that the floor beneath him might not be as solid as he'd assumed. "Who are you?" he said again, quieter now, truly. "Your Chancellor is stealing from the northern levies," Yseult said, and once the first sentence was out, the rest came like a dam breaking, 5 years of held breath spilling into the cold council chamber air. "He has been for longer than the Hallowmere garrison has gone unpaid. He diverted the war levies my father discovered 3 seasons before he died, before your father's court called it an accident, and burned House Varn to the ground to bury the discovery with it. I am not a serving girl who wandered into your kitchens, Your Grace. My name is Yseult Varn, and I have spent 5 years watching this man lie to your face, because I did not believe you would listen to anyone else's." The king did not move. Somewhere below them, the hold's night bell rang the 2nd hour, faint and far away, and Yseult had the strange floating sense of watching herself say the words she had rehearsed and abandoned and rehearsed again for 5 years, finally, irrevocably spoken. "Prove it," Hrothmar said. His voice had not risen. If anything, it had gone quieter, and that quiet was worse than any shout could have been, the quiet of a man deciding in real time whether the ground under his entire reign was about to give way. "I can," Yseult said. "I have ledger copies, a letter in his own hand, 3 witnesses who will speak if they believe they'll be protected for it. I have spent 5 years building a case I was too afraid to bring you, because the man I would be accusing has been at your side since before you could walk unassisted, and because the last time my family tried to tell the truth about him, they burned for it." For a long moment, the king said nothing at all. He looked at her, really looked, the way she had spent 5 years training herself to avoid being looked at, and something in his face shifted from disbelief through fury and settled, finally, on something that looked almost like grief. "Show me," he said. "Everything. Tonight." They did not sleep that night, or the 2 that followed it. Yseult brought her evidence in pieces, cautious even now, watching the king's face change, as ledger page after ledger page confirmed what she had spent 5 years assembling in the dark. She watched him read the half-burned letter 3 times, his thumb pressed white against the scorched edge, and she watched something in him break and reform, harder, when he reached the final line, an instruction, in Strather's own careful hand, referencing the Varn matter, as though her family's deaths had been a line item in someone's ledger. "He was at my father's deathbed," Hrothmar said at one point, to no one, to the map table, to the cold grey dawn coming up outside the window. "He held my father's hand when he died. He taught me how to read a treaty before I could read a bedtime story." "I know," Yseult said. "That's exactly why it worked." It was the kind of truth that could break a lesser man's trust in everyone forever. She watched it nearly do that to him, watched him go from a king who trusted too easily to one who, for one terrible hour before dawn, seemed ready to trust no one at all, including, she feared, her. But when the sun came fully up over Caerwyn Hold, King Hrothmar Aldane did something Yseult had not predicted in 5 years of imagining this moment. He asked her to help him take Strath down properly, quietly, with evidence too thorough to be argued away, rather than in a burst of royal fury that Strath's decade of careful alliances might survive. "You've spent 5 years building this in silence," the king said, and for the first time his voice held something that was not command, but something closer to respect. "You know his web better than my own spy master does. I would be a fool not to use that." It took another 6 weeks, 6 weeks of careful, quiet unraveling, of turning frightened witnesses into willing ones, of the king himself learning to lie convincingly enough to keep Strath from suspecting anything until the trap was fully built. The first task was Captain Voss. Yseult argued, over Hrothmar's initial objection, that the garrison commander should not simply be arrested. Arrested men could be silenced, or worse, could take secrets to a grave before they were forced to give them up. Instead, the king quietly reassigned Voss to a ceremonial post at the far southern border, ostensibly an honour, in truth a removal from anywhere he could interfere or warn Strath that the ground was shifting. Voss went, grumbling but unsuspecting, and the eastern garrison passed into hands the king trusted absolutely. Hands Yseult had spent 3 days quietly vetting through old kitchen connections before she gave her approval. The second task was harder. The frightened clerk, who kept Strath's true ledgers beneath his floorboards, a thin, anxious young man named Percy Adderley, had to be approached without ever once being seen approaching. Yseult managed it in the end, not through threat, but through a kindness she suspected no one in Strather's employ had shown him in years. She found him alone in the scriptorium late one evening, ostensibly delivering him a meal the kitchens had forgotten, and simply asked him quietly whether he had ever wanted to stop being afraid. Percy Adderley wept before he agreed to help them, and confessed that he had begun keeping his own private copy of certain ledger entries 2 years earlier, in case I ever needed proof that I tried to be honest, even if I was too much of a coward to say so out loud. Yseult did not think him a coward at all. She recognized in him an earlier version of herself, someone gathering fragments of truth in the dark, waiting for a moment brave enough to use them in. The third task belonged to the king alone, and it was, Yseult thought, the hardest of the three. Hrothmar had to sit across from the man who had taught him to read treaties, who had stood at his father's deathbed, who had spent a decade being the single most trusted voice in his ear, and smile at him, ask his counsel, thank him for his service, all while every fibre of the king's considerable will strained against the deception. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Hrothmar admitted to her one night, 3 weeks into the unraveling, his voice raw in a way she had never heard it. They sat together in the small council chamber, the same room where she had first spoken his Chancellor's true nature aloud, papers spread between them like a battlefield map. "Every day I sit across from him, and he asks after my health, my sleep, whether the northern matter troubles me, and I answer him, and smile, and all I can think of is your family's roof coming down." "You can," Yseult said, "because the alternative is that he escapes with the alliances he's spent 30 years building fully intact and rebuilds his web somewhere else, with someone else's house next to burn. I know the cost of what I'm asking. I have paid a version of it for 5 years, but it ends properly, or it doesn't end at all, it only moves." Hrothmar was quiet a long moment, looking at her with an expression she still did not entirely trust herself to name. "You make it very difficult," he said finally, "to disagree with you about anything." "Good," Yseult said, and for the first time in either of their memories, she smiled at him, without meaning to hide it. 6 weeks in which Yseult Varn stopped being invisible, and became gradually, impossibly, someone the king consulted, argued with, and, she noticed with a feeling she refused to name, sought out even when the evidence had nothing left to reveal. He began finding reasons to walk the same corridors she walked. He began, without ever remarking on it, having a second cup set at his private table when he took his evening meal alone, as though some part of him had simply decided, without asking her, that she belonged there. She let him. That, more than anything, told her how much had changed. There was a night, near the end of it, when they sat together over the final compiled case, the ledgers, the letter, the sworn witness statements, and Hrothmar looked up at her across the table with an expression that had nothing to do with treason or treasury or the crown at all. 5 years, he said quietly. "You could have told me sooner." "I was afraid," Yseult admitted, "of what would happen to me, and some part of me, afraid of what it would do to you, to learn that the man you trusted most had been lying to you the whole time you trusted him. It's done that regardless," he said. "The only difference now is that I'm not alone in knowing it." He reached across the table, not for a ledger, but for her hand, and for the first time in 5 years, Yseult Varn let herself be seen. The morning of the trial, Cerwynhold's great hall, filled to a capacity Yseult had never seen in 5 years of clearing its floors. Every border lord who could travel in time had come, drawn by rumours that had outpaced the truth in every direction, as rumours do. Yseult stood near the king's dais, no longer required to keep her eyes down, and felt the strange vertigo of being looked at, openly, by an entire court that had spent 5 years looking straight through her. Straithe entered, composed, immaculate, every inch the trusted statesman he had spent 30 years constructing. Yseult watched him scan the room and falter, almost imperceptibly, when his gaze landed on her standing beside the throne rather than behind a serving tray. It was the first time in 5 years she had seen him look, even briefly, uncertain. The trial, when it finally came, was quiet and devastating in equal measure. Straithe stood before the full council with the ledgers laid out in front of him, his own letter read aloud in a hall gone utterly silent, and the frightened young clerk, no longer frightened, standing straighter than Yseult had ever seen him, confirming every figure under oath. Two of the Eastern garrison's junior officers, freed by Voss's quiet removal to speak without fear of reprisal, corroborated the delayed disbursements in testimony that left no border lord in the hall with any doubt remaining. Strather did not deny it in the end. He simply looked at the king with something like disbelief, as though the true betrayal in the room was not 5 years of theft and one house burned to ashes, but the fact that the crown had finally noticed. "I built this kingdom's treasury as much as your father did," Straith said, "and there was real venom in it, real wounded pride. I have served 3 decades. You murdered a house of 9 people to hide 5 years of theft," Hrothmar said, and his voice was the coldest Yseult had ever heard it, colder than the night she'd first spoken his true Chancellor's name aloud. "There is no service that buys that back." Straith was stripped of title, land, and name that same hour. What became of him afterward, exile, imprisonment, the details varied depending on which corner of the hold you asked, mattered less to Yseult than the simple fact that her family's name, House Varn, was read aloud in the council hall for the first time in 5 years, not as a footnote to an accident, but as the truth, murdered, and finally, publicly, avenged. Spring came properly to Caerwyn Hold for the first time in years. The northern garrison paid in full, the treasury audited and repaired, a new chancellor appointed from among the honest. Yseult Varn was offered formally the return of her house's lands and title. She took the title. She did not, in the end, take the lands. Some things, she told the king quietly, were easier to let go of than to rebuild. Percy Adderley was made under-chancellor of the treasury within the month, a promotion he accepted with the stunned disbelief of a man who had spent 2 years certain his honesty would only ever endanger him. Captain Voss's replacement in the east proved as steady as Yseult had promised, and within a season the northern garrison had not only been paid in full, but doubled in strength against the border troubles that had, all along, been Strath's making rather than misfortune. But it was the quieter changes at Caerwyn Hold that Yseult noticed most. The king began holding open council once a fortnight, where any lord or steward could bring grievances directly, rather than filtering them through a single trusted adviser's judgment. He appointed not one new chancellor to replace Strath's singular authority, but a small council of 3, deliberately built so that no one voice could again grow powerful enough to go unquestioned. It was, Yseult thought, exactly the kind of change a man makes when a 5-year lie has taught him precisely how much a single point of failure can cost. "Then what will you take?" Hrothmar asked her on an evening in early spring, when the ice on the hold's outer walls had finally begun to melt, dripping steady and bright in the last of the sun. They stood together on the same battlement where, as a serving girl, she had once carried firewood past him, without daring to meet his eyes, and the strangeness of standing there now, beside him, unhidden, was not lost on her. Yseult considered the question longer than she'd expected to. "I spent 5 years learning how to watch a court lie without flinching," she said finally. "I would like now to spend some years learning how to sit in one that doesn't." Hrothmar's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close enough that she'd learned, over the last 6 weeks, to recognize it as one. "That," he said, "I think I can arrange." He did not propose that spring, not formally. There was too much rebuilding still to do, too many alliances to steady after Strath's fall, and Yseult would not have wanted a hurried thing built on the ashes of a scandal. But there was an understanding between them by midsummer that the whole hold could see plainly enough, in the way the king's eyes found her across a room he'd once made sure never to look at her in, and in the way Yseult Varn no longer lowered her gaze when he did. There were quiet evenings that summer that Yseult would keep, privately, for the rest of her life, walking the orchard behind the hold's east wall, while Hrothmar told her, haltingly, things about his father's reign he had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even Straith in 30 years of confidence. There was an afternoon when he taught her, badly and with great patience, to read a treaty the way his own father had once taught him, and laughed, genuinely, unguardedly, a sound she had heard perhaps twice in 5 years of watching him from across a hall, when she pointed out a clause even his own scribes had overlooked. There was also, inevitably, a harder evening, some months after the trial, when doubt crept in the way it does after any great upheaval. A border lord's wife, newly arrived at court and unaware of the history between them, remarked within Yseult's hearing that it was a strange thing for a king to elevate a former servant so far above her station, whatever service she had rendered the crown. Yseult said nothing in reply. 5 years of silence had at least taught her when a battle wasn't worth fighting in a stranger's drawing-room. But Hrothmar found her afterward on the same battlement where he'd once asked what she would take, and found her closed off in a way he hadn't seen since the night she'd first spoken Straith's name. "You're allowed to be angry at what she said," he told her quietly. "I'm not angry," Yseult said. "I'm tired of being a story people tell about themselves. The servant girl who caught the Chancellor, the girl who whispered treason in the dark. I would like someday to simply be a woman standing beside you because I chose to, and you chose me back, not a cautionary tale about how far a clever girl can climb." Hrothmar considered this longer than she expected. "Then let me say it plainly, where anyone in this hold can hear it," he said. "I am not elevating a servant, Yseult. I am asking a woman I have come, slowly, and against every careful habit I built after Straither, to trust more than I have trusted anyone in my life, including myself, whether she will stand beside me, not because the crown owes her a debt, but because I want her there." It was not, technically, a proposal, but it was close enough that Yseult found she did not particularly mind the distinction. 5 years, she thought sometimes, watching him from across the same high table she had once served wine at, 5 years of silence, and it had taken exactly one true sentence to end it. She had feared, for so long, that speaking would cost her everything. It had, in the end, cost her nothing at all, and given her more than she had ever let herself imagine wanting. When she finally did speak the words that mattered most, not accusation this time, but something far simpler, offered quietly one evening with no ledgers and no witnesses between them, the king went still in exactly the way he had that first terrible night in the council chamber, but this time, when the stillness broke, it broke into something warm. "Say that again," he said, echoing himself without seeming to notice. "I love you," Yseult Varn said, for the first time, and not, she suspected, the last. "I have for longer than I let myself admit. Long enough that I was more afraid of this sentence than I ever was of the one about your Chancellor." And King Hrothmar Aldane, who had spent a lifetime learning to trust almost no one, who had lost 5 years to a lie standing at his own right hand, reached for her the way a man reaches for solid ground, and found, at last, that it held.